In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the public was told a story of abduction. But what if the abduction never happened? Why was the last photo of her altered? Why did the metadata vanish? If she was last seen on May 3rd, why can no one place her anywhere after Sunday, April 29th? My belief is that Madeleine died in that apartment, and her body was moved in a rental car weeks after she died. I believe there has been a high-level cover-up. If you want to know what really happened, like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. Because what if the real timeline had already been rewritten, days before the world even knew her name? The night of May 3rd, 2007, began with the unremarkable sounds of a holiday resort settling into its evening rhythm. There was the distant murmur of conversation, the faint clinking of cutlery and glasses from the tapas restaurant. It was a soundscape of normalcy, of families on vacation, relaxed and unsuspecting. That normalcy was torn apart. A sound pierced the calm. It was not a call or a simple cry, but a raw, primal scream that shattered the placid air of Praia de los. The sound belonged to Kate McCann. She was running, described by all who saw her as frantic and in a state of pure hysteria, moving from the apartment block back towards the restaurant where she and her friends were dining. The words she shouted would become the foundation of a story that would captivate and divide the world for nearly 2 decades. She did not shout, "She's gone," or "I can't find her." She shouted, "They've taken her." According to her testimony, this moment of profound terror was the culmination of her 3rd check on her children that evening. She had left the dinner table and returned to apartment 5A. She claimed she entered the children's bedroom to find an absence that stopped her heart. Her 3-year-old daughter, Madeleine, was missing from her bed. In that instant, the official narrative was born. Kate McCann claimed she found the bedroom window open, the shutter raised. The curtain, she stated, was blowing in the breeze. This collection of details, the open window, the moving curtain, the empty bed, created an immediate and powerful image, a violation by an unknown intruder. That moment, that specific sequence of events, would define the official story. For the next 17 years, the public would be told of a phantom abductor, an unknown figure who had somehow entered a holiday apartment in southern Portugal. A figure who had taken a child from her bed while her parents dined less than 100 meters away, and then vanished without a sound, without a trace. Within hours, the narrative was seized by international media. It spread faster than any forensic team could work. Headlines from the BBC, from Sky News, from The Guardian, all echoed a consistent and unified frame. Missing toddler feared abducted from Algarve resort. Madeleine kidnapped as parents dined nearby. No one waited for a detailed forensic analysis. No one paused to question the staggering implausibility of a silent, invisible kidnapper executing such a flawless crime in a busy resort. The world, it seemed, had made up its mind before the investigation had even truly begun. But what if that mind was deliberately manipulated? What if the public was never given the truth, but was instead given a script? A script that, as some investigators believe, had been carefully prepared days before the world even knew Madeleine's name. The official narrative, born in that moment of hysteria, rested entirely on a single, crucial prop: the open bedroom window of apartment 5A. This was the alleged point of entry and exit. It was the detail that transformed a terrifying domestic scenario, a missing child, into a cinematic crime, an abduction by a phantom stranger. But as the calm of morning arrived, and forensic investigators began their meticulous work, that central prop began to crumble under scrutiny. When the physical evidence of the room was compared to the story being told, the two did not align. They were, in fact, in stark contradiction. There were no signs of forced entry. This was the first and most glaring inconsistency. The window latch was intact. The glass was unbroken. The exterior shutters, which Kate McCann claimed had been forced open, showed no damage. Investigators who examined the mechanism argued that it was physically implausible for those shutters to have been opened from the outside without leaving significant marks, scrapes, chips, or indentations from a tool. None were found. If an abductor had indeed climbed through that window, they would have been required to perform a complex act of silent entry. Yet, the sill itself was clean. It bore no scuff marks from shoes, no fibers from clothing, no disturbance of the dust that naturally settles. More crucially, the investigation turned up fingerprints on the window frame, but they did not belong to an unknown intruder. The only fingerprints identified on the window belonged to Kate McCann. This was a profoundly disturbing discovery. The one piece of physical evidence found at the supposed entry point pointed not to a faceless kidnapper, but back to the very person who had raised the alarm. The absence of evidence became, in itself, a form of evidence. If an adult had climbed in, navigated a dark room, located one specific child among three, lifted her, and then climbed back out, a trail would be expected. A disturbance. A partial print on the wall. A strand of hair. A drop of sweat. Yet, nothing was found. No foreign DNA. No unfamiliar fibers. No unidentified footprints were discovered in the soft flower bed beneath the window. No traces of soil or debris were found on the bedroom floor just inside. The scene was, forensically speaking, sterile. It was too clean. This gaping void between the story and the science led some investigators, including Richard D. Hall, to a deeply unsettling hypothesis. He argues that the physical reality of apartment 5A contradicted the entire narrative. He refers to it as a staged scene, a scene carefully constructed to mimic an abduction, but one that was never intended to withstand proper, detailed investigation. The story required a violation, and the open window provided the visuals for that violation. The evidence, however, told a very different story. It told a story of silence and of an impossible entry. If the open window in apartment 5A was the pillar of the physical narrative, another piece of evidence served as the anchor of the emotional one. It is an image that has become iconic, known to the world simply as the last photo. According to the McCanns, this picture was captured by Jerry McCann on the afternoon of May 3rd, just hours before Madeleine reportedly vanished. The image, featuring Madeleine with her younger sister and Kate McCann, was presented as a snapshot of tranquil family life. To the mainstream media and a sympathetic public, this image became a symbol. It was the heart-wrenching before a final, precious glimpse into a moment of serenity that would soon be shattered by an unthinkable crime. It grounded the timeline, giving the world a concrete, verifiable moment of Madeleine's existence on the day she disappeared. But to investigative analysts like Richard D. Hall, the photograph is anything but comforting. When subjected to forensic scrutiny, he argues, the photo ceases to be a simple family snapshot. It becomes, in his view, a calculated construction, a piece of evidence riddled with deep and profound inconsistencies. The first and most striking red flag comes not from what is seen in the image, but from the very source of light captured within it. Jerry McCann claimed the photo was taken at precisely 2:29 in the afternoon. Yet, analysis of the lighting presents a significant challenge to this timeline. The angle of the sunlight and the placement of the shadows cast by the subjects are inconsistent with mid-afternoon. The shadows fall almost directly below them, suggesting the sun was not at an angle, but was instead nearly at its zenith, high overhead. This quality of intense, direct light is characteristic of midday, far closer to noon, not halfway through the afternoon. This discrepancy alone, while subtle, is enough to call the stated timeline into serious question. The analysis, however, digs deeper. If the photo were truly taken on the afternoon of May 3rd, it must reflect the prevailing weather conditions officially recorded for that day. It does not. Meteorological data from the nearby Lagos weather station provides a clear and unambiguous record for May 3rd, 2007. That day was reported as largely cloudy, breezy, and overcast. The quality of light would have been diffused, softened by the cloud cover. The image, however, depicts the exact opposite. It shows a crystal-clear sky, intense brightness, and sharp, defined shadows, conditions utterly uncharacteristic of the overcast weather documented that afternoon. In his documentaries, Hall juxtaposes this image with other photographs taken by members of the Tapas group on May 2nd and May 3rd. All of those other images, taken by other people on the days in question, reflect the subdued light and gray skies described in the official weather reports. The last photo, by contrast, stands alone. It appears visibly sharper, sunnier, and more vibrant. This creates a jarring visual discord that cannot be easily explained away by camera settings or chance. But the most critical, and perhaps most damning, point in this critique centers on what is missing from the photograph. Every digital photograph taken by a camera or a phone automatically embeds hidden information known as EXIF data. This metadata is the image's digital fingerprint. It is not optional. It contains the essential, indisputable facts of the image's creation: the exact time and date the photo was taken, the camera model used, the aperture settings, and sometimes even location coordinates. It is the independent, scientific verification that anchors an image in time. In the case of the last photo, all EXIF data was gone. The image released to the public and, critically, to the police, had been completely and thoroughly stripped of this crucial information. The explanation provided was that the original image had been transferred between devices, perhaps compressed or modified for publication, resulting in an incidental loss of the metadata. To forensic analysts, this explanation is insufficient. They argue this was not an incidental loss. It was an intentional and methodical tampering. One cannot, they insist, accidentally delete or scrub metadata multiple times across different formats and devices. What the world was given was not an original file. It was a sterilized image. It was an image that had been manually stripped of the very data that could validate or, more importantly, refute the story attached to it. Without the metadata, there is no independent verification of when that photo was taken. For a picture that allegedly anchors the final living moments of a missing child, this absence is far from trivial. It is, as Hall puts it, a photographic ghost, assigned a fabricated timestamp. This lack of verification, combined with the glaring contradictions in lighting and the weather, feeds directly into a broader, more ominous theory. Was this photograph deliberately backdated to cover a terrifying gap in the real timeline? This manipulation of time, this fundamental challenge to the last photo, is not merely a technical discrepancy. It is a fracture that breaks open the entire official timeline. If the photograph does not belong to May 3rd, then when was it taken? Investigators like Richard D. Hall present a compelling and forensically supported case for Sunday, April 29th. According to resort logs, April 29th was the very first day that the McCann family used the Ocean Club pool facilities. More importantly, meteorological records confirm that this day, and only this day, during their entire stay, featured the exact weather conditions visible in the photograph: clear skies, strong, direct sunlight, and favorable temperatures. The image is a perfect match for April 29th. It is a complete mismatch for May 3rd. This realization is profound. If the last known photograph of Madeleine was actually taken on April 29th, it means the last photo was not the last photo at all. It was an old photo, recycled from an earlier, happier day. This possibility immediately casts the official narrative into shadow. It opens up a dark, undocumented space in the timeline. If the last verifiable image of Madeleine is from April 29th, and she was not reported missing until the night of May 3rd, a critical question emerges. What happened in the days in between? This period, from April 30th until the alarm was raised, has become known to researchers as the 4-day void. It is an alarming and uninterrupted visual gap. In an era saturated with digital cameras and phones, on a family holiday where snapshots are constant, this blackout is deeply troubling. There are no verified images, no confirmed independent sightings, and no independent documentation of Madeleine McCann being alive or well during this entire 96-hour window. This absence is not just limited to photographs. The void extends to the official paper trail that should have existed, the records from the Ocean Club's creche or daycare center. According to the official story, Madeleine attended the creche on the days leading up to her disappearance. These records should have provided an independent, verifiable log of her presence. They should have filled the void. But according to Hall and other independent researchers who have scrutinized the documents released by the Portuguese police, the crash records contain their own profound irregularities. They are not the clean, objective log one would expect. Some entries appear altered. The handwriting on certain dates is inconsistent with the handwriting on others. Most troubling, there are serious questions regarding the authenticity of signatures, including some attributed to Kate McCann. To an analyst's eye, the records do not look like a contemporaneous log, filled out day by day. They look like a document that may have been adjusted, corrected, or perhaps even constructed after the fact. If true, the implications are chilling. Why would a family need to recycle an old photograph and present it as new? Why would crash records, the only official paper trail, show signs of alteration? The only logical answer, investigators argue, is that this was a deliberate effort at fabrication. It was an attempt to fill a void, to paper over a gap, and to build a believable, normal timeline for the days of April 30th, May 1st, and May 2nd. It was an attempt to retroactively prove that Madeleine was alive and well, precisely because, perhaps, she was not. If the last photo was indeed from April 29th, then the entire foundation of the May 3rd abduction claim collapses. The investigation is no longer about a stranger who appeared on a Thursday night. The investigation becomes about a 96-hour void. This is the question that haunts the case. If Madeleine McCann did not disappear on May 3rd, then what really happened to her at the end of April? The 4-day void, that period of profound silence and missing visual evidence stretching from the end of April, is not entirely empty. While the cameras and the independent sightings may have ceased, a different kind of record emerged. It was an auditory record, provided by a witness whose testimony remains one of the most crucial, yet bafflingly underreported, elements of the entire case. Her name was Mrs. Pamela Fenn. Mrs. Fenn was not part of the holiday group. She was not a friend or a relative. She was a neutral observer, a local resident who was staying in the apartment unit located directly, immediately above apartment 5A. Her proximity made her an unintentional ear witness, able to hear the acoustics of the life, or the distress, unfolding just beneath her feet. In her formal, signed statement given to the Portuguese authorities, Mrs. Fenn detailed a specific and deeply troubling event. It occurred on the night of Tuesday, May 1st. This date is critical. It falls squarely in the middle of that unexplained void, a full 2 days before the alarm of abduction was raised. On that night, beginning at approximately 10:30 in the evening and continuing relentlessly until just before midnight, Mrs. Fenn reported hearing a child crying. She was clear in her statement that this was not the intermittent, brief fussing of a toddler settling down for the night. She described the sound as persistent, distressed, and profoundly upsetting. It was a child wailing, loud enough to clearly penetrate the floor and ceiling separating the two apartments. It went on, she insisted, for well over an hour. But even more disturbing than the sound of the persistent crying was the sound that Mrs. Fenn did not hear. In all that time, she reported hearing no corresponding adult activity. There was no comforting voice. There were no audible footsteps moving to the child's room. There was no sound of a parent attempting to soothe or attend to the child. The crying was simply left to continue, isolated and unanswered, until it eventually tapered off into silence around midnight. The next morning, Mrs. Fenn noted, she received no inquiry from her neighbors below. There was no polite apology for the noise, no casual explanation, no acknowledgement whatsoever that the incident had even occurred. It was as if the hour of desperate crying had been erased by the morning light. To investigative analysts, this testimony is not a minor anecdote. It is, quite possibly, the last known, independent evidence that Madeleine was alive. If that crying child was indeed Madeleine, the implications are staggering, and they challenge the official narrative at its very core. The story presented by the parents and their friends was one of attentive, cautious parenting, involving a system of regular 30-minute checks. An hour of sustained, distressed wailing from a child does not align with that narrative. It suggests a period of significant neglect. Furthermore, it places Madeleine in a state of deep distress in the middle of the 4-day void. If this was the last night she was heard, what happened in the 46 hours that followed, between the crying stopping near midnight on May 1st and Kate McCann's scream on the night of May 3rd? If the crying child was not Madeleine, but one of the younger twins, the question remains. Why was a child left in such a state of severe distress for such a prolonged period? The most profound question, however, is not about the sound itself, but about the silence that followed it in the investigation. Why was this testimony, from a credible, neutral witness with no agenda, not pursued with vigor by the mainstream media or the subsequent United Kingdom investigation? It did not fit the story of a happy, normal family holiday, suddenly interrupted by a stranger. It suggested a different, darker prelude, one that began long before any window was supposedly forced open. As the official narrative of an abduction by a stranger began to solidify on the night of May 3rd, it required more than just an open window and a missing child. An abduction requires an abductor. The story, to be plausible, needed a sighting. It needed a perpetrator, however fleeting. Just minutes before Kate McCann's scream of, "They've taken her," shattered the night, the first phantom appeared. This crucial sighting was provided not by an independent bystander, but by a member of the McCann's own dinner party, Jane Tanner. She was one of the Tapas 7, the group of friends dining with the parents. Her account, given to police, would become the first critical piece of evidence supporting the stranger abduction theory. It would define the initial trajectory of the entire investigation. According to her testimony, the event occurred at approximately 9:15 in the evening. This timing is critical. It was shortly after Jerry McCann had reportedly performed his own check, and just before Kate McCann would make her final, terrible discovery. Jane Tanner claimed she was walking back towards the restaurant after having gone to check on her own children. As she walked up the street from the apartment block, she reported seeing a man walking briskly, crossing the road ahead of her. This man, she claimed, was not empty-handed. He was carrying a small child in his arms. The description she offered seemed, at first, compelling. The child, she said, was dressed in what appeared to be light-colored pajamas, possibly with a pattern. The man was moving with purpose, heading away from the apartments and towards the outer boundaries of the resort. On the surface, this was the bombshell the story needed. A man carrying a child in pajamas at that exact time, in that exact location. It seemed to be the missing link. But the location of this alleged sighting is precisely where the account begins to unravel. Jane Tanner described the man walking right past the top of the street, intersecting the very path she was on. This exact location, at this exact moment in the timeline, was not empty. Jerry McCann himself was present. He was standing at the top of that same road, engaged in a sustained conversation with another holiday guest named Jez Wilkins. This creates an almost impossible scenario, a staggering contradiction. Remarkably, neither Jerry McCann nor Jez Wilkins reported seeing anyone fitting that description. They both confirmed seeing Jane Tanner walk by them. Yet they did not see a mysterious man. They did not see a man carrying a child in pajamas. It raises a serious, fundamental question of plausibility. How could two men, standing stationary and alert in a quiet street, fail to notice another adult carrying a child, passing just feet away from them? For Tanner's account to be true, this phantom figure must have possessed an invisibility to two nearby, attentive witnesses. The implausibility deepens when examining the description Tanner provided of the man himself. It was, in essence, a ghost sketch. While she reported details of the child's clothing, the man remained a complete blur. She described him as wearing light-colored trousers and dark shoes, but that was all. She could not recall any distinguishing features. She had no clear view of his face. She could offer no hair color, no estimation of height or build, no description of his gait or perceived age. The figure was a cipher, too faint to pursue in any meaningful forensic sense, yet just specific enough to plant the powerful image of a kidnapping in progress. Beyond the physical contradictions, there is the behavioral one. Jane Tanner was a mother, part of a group supposedly concerned enough to implement a checking system. If she genuinely saw a stranger, a man she did not recognize from the resort or their group carrying a small child in pajamas away from the apartments at night, why did she not intervene? Why did she not raise the alarm, alert someone, or even mention this deeply unusual sight to her friends back at the restaurant? According to the accepted timeline, she said nothing. She simply returned to her dinner. The sighting was only given weight and significance later, after Kate McCann had raised the alarm, nearly an hour later. To analysts like Richard D. Hall, the Tannerman sighting cannot be viewed as a simple mistake or a trick of the light. He posits that it served a clear, strategic purpose. It was the first, critical injection of the abduction idea into the timeline, introduced before any contrary forensic evidence could take hold. It was not a clue to be solved. It was a narrative seed. It gave the emerging story a direction and, most importantly, it gave the media the first of many phantoms to chase. The phantom figure described by Jane Tanner was not the only sighting that night. As the official narrative took hold, focusing the world's attention on the Tannerman as the likely abductor, another report, from a completely independent source, was quietly filed with the Portuguese authorities. This second sighting occurred later, at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. The witnesses were not part of the Tapas group. They were the Smith family, a group of Irish tourists, completely unconnected to the McCanns or their friends, who were simply walking home from a nearby restaurant. Their neutrality is what makes their testimony so critical and so troubling. As they walked along a public road not far from the Ocean Club resort, they saw a man walking in the opposite direction. Like the Tanner man, this individual was also carrying a child. But here, the details were different, and in some ways, more specific. The child was small, with blonde hair, and appeared to be asleep, dressed in what they also believed to be light-colored pajamas. The man, however, was carrying the child in what they described as an awkward, almost clumsy manner, as if he were not accustomed to it. The child's head was down, and the man was holding the child with both arms, chest to chest. Crucially, the man was walking away from the beach and the main resort area. He was heading inland, towards the upper part of the village. At the time, the Smith family thought the scene was unusual. Perhaps a father taking a sleepy or unwell child home from a late dinner. It was odd, but it was not yet sinister. They did not know a child had been reported missing. Their account, given to the police, initially garnered little attention. It was just another piece of information in a growing and chaotic file. The true significance of their testimony would not become clear until several months later. Martin Smith, the family patriarch, was watching a news report about the case. The footage was not of a suspect, but of Jerry McCann himself, disembarking a plane and carrying one of his surviving twin children. In that moment, Martin Smith experienced a chilling flash of recognition. He admitted at once that he had not seen the man's face clearly on that dark street. It had been too poorly lit. But what he recognized was not the face. It was the build, the posture, and most specifically, the awkward, uncomfortable way the child was being held. The gait, the carriage, the entire physical presence of the man on the news footage, he claimed, was a powerful match for the man he and his family had seen walking on that road in Praia da Luz. This revelation was significant and deeply problematic for the official story. Martin Smith reported his amended statement to the authorities. The man he saw, the man carrying a child away from the resort at 10 o'clock, closely resembled Jerry McCann. If this sighting was accurate, the implications were devastating. It would mean that Madeleine had not been abducted by a stranger at 9:15. It would mean that the Tanner man was an irrelevance, a ghost. It would mean, instead, that at 10 o'clock in the evening, Madeleine was in the arms of her own father, being carried away from the apartment, just as the alarm was being raised. This was a direct, catastrophic contradiction to the entire abduction narrative. The reaction from the mainstream media, and, later, the United Kingdom police investigation, is perhaps the most telling part of this event. This lead was not pursued with any public vigor. It was not featured in press conferences. It was not the subject of dramatic appeals. Unlike the Tanner man sighting, which was broadcast globally and became a cornerstone of the investigation for years, the Smith man sighting was quietly suppressed. It was buried in files, dismissed by officials, and almost entirely ignored by the press. Operation Grange, the multi-million-pound task force, would only mention it years later to reinterpret it as mistaken or irrelevant. To investigative analysts, this selective suppression is the clearest sign of a managed narrative. The Tanner man sighting, full of contradictions but provided by an insider, was useful. The Smith man sighting, provided by a neutral family and pointing directly back at the parents, was dangerous. It was, in Hall's view, the sighting that posed the greatest risk to the official story, and for that reason, it had to be silenced. The narrative of a stranger abduction, though firmly established by the media, was forensically weak. The Tanner man sighting was contradicted by witnesses on the scene. The Smith man sighting, which pointed away from a stranger, was methodically ignored and buried. As the initial investigation in 2007 stalled, lacking any physical evidence or viable leads, the official story required new fuel. It needed fresh targets to maintain the illusion of a hunt, to keep the public focused on the idea of an external threat. This need gave rise to a series of decoy suspects, figures who would surface in the media, absorb public attention, and then vanish without charge. Their purpose served. The first of these was a man who came to be known as Sagra's man. He emerged later in 2007, a German individual who had been vacationing in the nearby town of Sagres around the time Madeleine disappeared. He was reportedly seen near the Ocean Club, and his appearance was perhaps deemed unusual enough to stir suspicion. He was not identified through forensics. He was not linked by DNA. He was not placed inside apartment 5A. Despite the complete lack of a concrete link, he became a focal point of intense media speculation, particularly by the British press. His photograph, his name, and his personal details were widely published. Headlines, both direct and implied, painted him as a significant person of interest, a potential suspect who might finally hold the answers. For a time, the world's attention was diverted to this new figure. The focus shifted away from the uncomfortable questions about the timeline, the window, or the contradictions in the top 7 statements. The hunt was now for Sagra's man. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was dismissed. He was later proven to have absolutely no connection whatsoever to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. No charges were ever brought. No apology for the public violation of his privacy was ever prominently offered. His only crime, it seemed, was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and fitting a convenient profile. To analysts like Richard D. Hall, Sagra's man was not an investigative lead. He was a media scapegoat. He was sacrificed to public curiosity, allowing the narrative of an active investigation to continue, while the real, difficult questions remained unasked. He was, in Hall's words, a useful distraction. If Sagra's man was a fleeting media creation, the next figure was a far more strategic and official maneuver. This suspect would not emerge for 6 long years. In 2013, DSI Andy Redwood, the lead of Operation Grange, the new, high-profile United Kingdom investigation, held a major televised appeal. He announced a significant breakthrough. They had, he claimed, solved the mystery of the Tanner man. This revelation was stunning. The Tanner man sighting, which had been the very foundation of the abduction theory, was now being officially rewritten. According to Redwood, the man Jane Tanner had seen was not the abductor. He was, they now claimed, an innocent British parent, a fellow vacationer who had been at the resort that night. This man, they explained, had simply been retrieving his own child from the Ocean Club's creche and was walking back to his apartment. He had been identified, spoken to, and entirely eliminated as a suspect. Suddenly, the Tanner man problem was solved. The sighting was explained away. But for analysts like Hall, this resolution raised far more questions than it answered. It was not a solution. It was a retroactive correction to a foundational error in the narrative. If this man was an innocent parent, why did it take 6 years and millions of pounds to identify him? Why had he not come forward himself in 2007, when the Tannerman sketch was one of the most famous images in the world. Furthermore, if Jane Tanner was familiar with the other families and parents using the creche, why had she not recognized this fellow parent at the time? But the most critical question was this. If the Tannerman citing the entire basis for the initial stranger abduction theory was now officially declared a mistake, why was the abduction theory itself not discarded? Why did Operation Grange not rewind the entire investigation back to that night and ask, if there was no abductor seen, what really happened? Instead, the creche man allowed the investigation to perform a miraculous piece of narrative surgery. They could remove the flawed Tannerman sighting, cleaning up the timeline's most glaring contradiction without ever threatening the central premise of the abduction. These figures, Sagre's man and creche man, were never real suspects. They were phantoms, tactical tools used to preserve the myth. One was a media decoy to divert public attention. The other was an official placeholder, a faceless father figure conjured 6 years later to mop up an inconvenient truth. Their role was not to uncover the truth, but to ensure the original story, despite its flaws, survived. In any investigation, human testimony can be flawed. Memory can be contaminated, stories can be coordinated, and timelines can be blurred by panic or by design. But in the forensic world, there are witnesses that do not lie. They are objective, biological instruments that operate on scent, and they cannot be persuaded or intimidated. After the initial sweep of apartment 5A yielded no intruder DNA, no unidentified fingerprints, and no clear forensic trail leading out of the window, the Portuguese investigators, weeks into the case, introduced 2 such witnesses. They were specialists, brought in from the elite canine unit of the South Yorkshire Police. One was named Eddie. Eddie was a cadaver dog, an animal trained to detect the unique and specific chemical compounds released by human decomposition. He could identify the scent of death itself, even in microscopic traces. The other was named Kella. Kella was a blood detection dog, trained to find the mere presence of human blood, even if it was invisible to the human eye, even if it had been scrubbed and cleaned, and even if only the smallest trace remained. What these 2 animals found, or rather, what they reported, created a new and terrifying forensic map of apartment 5A. It was a map that completely contradicted the official narrative of a stranger entering from the outside. Eddie, the cadaver dog, was brought into the apartment. He did not alert at the door. He did not alert in the main living area at first. He was led into the bedroom, where Madeleine was last said to have slept, and there, he gave a clear, intense, and undeniable reaction. The location of his alert was chillingly specific. It was not by the window, the alleged entry point. It was in the corner of the room, at the foot of the bed, near a wardrobe. The very space Madeleine was said to have occupied. This was the first signal, indicating the possible presence of a decomposing body, or an item contaminated by that specific scent, in the child's own sleeping area. But Eddie was not finished. He alerted again, this time in the living room. The location was, if anything, more baffling and suspicious. He signaled strongly to an area behind the living room sofa. This was not a bedroom. This was not an obvious place for a child. It was a concealed space. To investigators like Hall, this alert suggested something deeply disturbing. It suggested movement, concealment, and intent. It raised the possibility that a body had been temporarily held or hidden in this location, perhaps in panic, perhaps during a staged cleanup. Then came Kella, the blood detection dog. The human investigators and their chemical tests had found no visible blood. The apartment appeared clean. Kella, however, alerted in the same apartment. She gave a reaction indicating the presence of human blood, not on the surface of the floor, but from beneath the tiles, near the grout. This is a critical scientific distinction. When a surface is cleaned, especially a porous material like ceramic tile grout, the cleaning fluids do not necessarily destroy the evidence. Water and bleach, Hall explains, can simply push the molecules, the blood cells, the scent compounds deeper beneath the visible layer. They settle into the subflooring, into the microscopic gaps in the grout, hidden from the human eye. Kayla is trained to detect these hidden traces. She found what no human, and no chemical swab, had been able to locate. But the most damning findings from these silent witnesses came not from where they did alert, but from where they did not. Both dogs were methodically run along the key areas of the abduction theory. They were presented to the open bedroom window. They were run along the sill. They were run through the flower bed directly below the window, where an abductor would have had to stand and climb. In these crucial locations, neither dog reacted. Eddie did not find the scent of decomposition. Kella did not find a trace of blood. There was no sign of a struggle, no forensic trail of a stranger. The dogs, with their remarkable and proven accuracy, had drawn a map. This forensic map did not lead to the window. It did not point to an intruder. It pointed, with chilling precision, to the corner of the bedroom, to the hidden space behind the sofa, and to the floor beneath the tiles. The animals had told a story, and it was a story that took place entirely inside apartment 5A. The forensic map drawn by Eddie and Kella was not limited to apartment 5A. As the investigation progressed into the summer of 2007, the focus of the canine units was directed toward a new and seemingly unrelated item, a silver Renault Scenic. This was not a car that had been present on the night of the disappearance. It was not a vehicle seen speeding away from the resort. It was a rental car, a hire car, acquired by the McCanns. The timing of its acquisition is, perhaps, the most unsettling fact in the entire investigation. The car was not rented on May 3rd or May 4th, in a panic to search for a missing child. It was hired on May 27th, a full 24 days after Madeleine had been reported missing. By this point, the official narrative was one of a global search for a living, abducted girl. The family were victims, awaiting a breakthrough. The car was, ostensibly, just a mundane tool for their personal transport. But investigators, following the disturbing alerts from the apartment, decided to present this new vehicle to the silent witnesses. If the scents from the apartment had transferred, perhaps they would be found here. What they discovered, in that sterile, unremarkable hire car, would become the most damning and controversial forensic finding of the case. Kella, the blood detection dog, was brought to the vehicle. She was run over the interior, the seats, the doors. She showed no reaction. But when she was presented to the boot, the trunk of the car, she gave a strong and clear alert. She was indicating the presence of human blood in the cargo area of a car rented 24 days after the event. Then came Eddie, the cadaver dog. He too was run over the interior without a signal. But when he reached the boot, he alerted, intensely. He signaled to the exact same area that Kella had identified. This was a powerful forensic echo. It was not just blood, and it was not just decomposition. It was both, together, in the same spot. The scent of decomposition takes time to develop. It is not present at the moment of death. Eddie's alert suggested that a body, already in a state of decomposition, had been present in that trunk. But Eddie's work was not finished. He provided a second, profoundly disturbing alert. He signaled not to the car itself, but to the key fob, the small plastic key used to open the car's doors. This alert, on such a small, personal object, was highly significant. A key is handled daily. It is carried in pockets, in hands. The scent of decomposition on the key suggested a direct physical cross-contamination. It implied that someone who had been in direct contact with a decomposing body had then, with those same hands, handled the car keys. It connected the scent from the hidden, concealed space of the trunk directly to the personal possession of the driver. These canine alerts, so specific and so disturbing, prompted a meticulous, inch-by-inch forensic swab of the boot's interior carpet and subflooring. The samples were sent for complex DNA analysis. The results, when they came back, were explosive. The laboratory found a partial, complex DNA profile. When this profile was tested, it was found to match 15 of 19 of Madeleine McCann's unique genetic markers. The scientific and legal implications were catastrophic. This was not a full 100% identification. But it was a forensically significant match that was incredibly difficult to explain. This finding, combined with the dog alerts, created an impossible timeline. The official narrative was about a child taken by a stranger on May 3rd. The forensic evidence, however, pointed to something else entirely. It pointed to the scent of blood, the scent of a decomposed body, and the partial DNA of that same child, all found in a car rented by the family 3.5 weeks later. The only logical, albeit terrifying, hypothesis that could connect these facts was that the car had been used to transport a body that had not been taken by a stranger, but had been stored, concealed somewhere else for over 3 weeks, and had then, long after the search had begun, been moved. In any complex investigation, the testimony of witnesses is expected to be fragile. Human memory is notoriously unreliable. It shifts, it warps under pressure, and different people recall the same event in profoundly different ways. Investigators are trained to look for these inconsistencies, to find the truth hidden within the natural contradictions of human recollection. But in the case of Madeleine McCann, the opposite problem presented itself. When analyzing the statements of the Tapas 7, the 7 friends who dined with Kate and Jerry McCann on the night of May 3rd, investigators were confronted with something far more alarming than simple contradiction. They were confronted with an unnatural, almost engineered, consistency. This was a wall of testimony. It was a narrative that, despite the chaos and panic of that night, remained immune to contradiction. It endured for nearly 2 decades, surviving intense scrutiny without a single, significant deviation from any member of the large group. This is the phenomenon that investigative analysts find so deeply suspicious. Is this genuine, shared memory? Or is it something else? Is it a coordinated narrative? Richard D. Hall applies the lens of group psychology to this phenomenon. He explores the concept of group memory contamination, a process where individuals, often unconsciously, begin to conform their own recollections to align with a dominant narrative shared within their group. Over time, the line blurs. They stop remembering what they personally experienced and start remembering what the group collectively reinforced. In the McCann case, the Tapas 7 maintained an unusually stable and synchronized story. The core of this story was the timeline of child checks, the supposed rotation system by which each adult would leave the table to inspect their own children. This system was presented as proof of their diligence. But when this timeline is analyzed, it reveals profound implausibilities. According to the various testimonies, someone was checking on the children roughly every 15 to 30 minutes. One member checked around 9:05 in the evening. Jane Tanner reportedly went at 9:15. Jerry McCann went around 9 o'clock. Matthew Oldfield went around 9:30. This created a near-constant patrol, a steady stream of adults walking from the restaurant, down the narrow path, into the apartment block, and back again. Yet, somehow, they rarely, if ever, crossed paths. No one reported seeing another member in the apartments. No independent witnesses from the resort reported seeing this constant parade of people checking on rooms. The most glaring logical failure within this shared timeline remains the Tannerman paradox. Jane Tanner's account places her walking up the street past Jerry McCann and his acquaintance, Jez Wilkins, at the exact moment she sees the phantom abductor. Jerry McCann and Jez Wilkins, conversely, confirm they were standing in that exact spot. They confirm they saw Jane Tanner pass them, but they vehemently deny seeing any other man, let alone one carrying a child. Both of these accounts cannot be true. It is a physical impossibility. One of them must be mistaken, or one of them is not telling the truth. Yet, the group holds both of these contradictory statements as fact. The wall does not crack. Perhaps more troubling than these internal contradictions is the fact that not one member of the Tapas 7 has ever broken ranks. In other major criminal cases, witnesses evolve. They revise their accounts. Memories falter, doubts creep in, and people seek to clear their conscience. But in this case, the wall has held firm. 17 years of silence. Even those who came under intense scrutiny, such as Jane Tanner, whose sighting became a focal point of confusion, have never altered their testimony. Matthew Oldfield, Another member offered a bizarrely passive statement that during his check, he had entered the McCann apartment, looked into the children's room, saw the twins, but somehow failed to ascertain if Madeleine was actually in her bed, which was obscured from his view. This level of uniformity, this absolute solidarity, feels less like the natural, chaotic result of honest recollection, and more like the product of mutual reinforcement. Hall refers to it as narrative engineering. It is a script, rehearsed and repeated until it became its own reality, an impenetrable fortress of agreement. If it is not the natural product of flawed, individual memory, then what is it? Why, in nearly 2 decades, has not one person from that dinner table emerged to challenge the official account? Why has no one offered a correction, admitted to a doubt, or broken the unified front? Investigative analysts, including Richard D. Hall, propose that the answer is not found in shared memory, but in calculated, mutual survival. He argues this is not necessarily an overt conspiracy, but rather a far more insidious and powerful phenomenon, a passive collusion. It is a pact of silence, an unspoken agreement where loyalty becomes a form of complicity, and silence becomes a weapon. To understand this pact, one must first understand the immense, life-altering stakes. The members of the Tapas 7 were not aimless youths. They were, for the most part, established professionals. Many, including the McCanns themselves, were doctors and medical specialists, individuals whose entire careers were built on a foundation of public trust, diligence, and sound judgment. They had everything to lose: their careers, their standing in the community, their financial security, and their family's reputation. This pact, Hall posits, may not have begun to cover up a monstrous crime. It may have begun, more simply, to cover up a simple, devastating, and career-ending truth: negligence. The entire story of the child checks, the meticulous 30-minute rotation, was a narrative necessity. The alternative admitting that 9 highly educated professionals left multiple young children, including infants, alone in unlocked ground-floor apartments while they dined and drank at a restaurant 100 meters away, was professionally unthinkable. That admission alone, in the harsh light of a tragedy, could expose all of them to severe legal liability, to professional review by medical boards, and to a level of public disgrace from which they might never recover. From this first, foundational, and necessary fabrication, the story of the diligent checks, the rest of the narrative had to be built. The wall had to hold, if only to protect them all from this initial, seismic admission of failure. But Hall's analysis suggests the silence is likely rooted in something far darker and more complex than just simple negligence. What if some members of the group suspect, or even know, that the abduction story is a fabrication? What if they fear that the truth is something more sinister, something that happened within their own circle, long before any alarm was raised? In this terrifying scenario, silence is no longer about protecting a career. It is about absolute self-preservation. To speak out would be to point a finger not at a phantom, but at a friend. It would be to unravel a deception that could implicate them all, either as accessories after the fact, or simply as witnesses who failed to speak the truth when it mattered. The bond of the group, forged in a shared, terrible event, becomes a prison. No one can leave the pact without destroying themselves and everyone else within it. This internal pact, Hall argues, was then massively reinforced from the outside. The Tapas 7 were not left to fend for themselves, isolated and vulnerable to Portuguese investigators. The Portuguese police, in their initial investigation, did indeed flag the group's many inconsistencies and the physical impossibilities of their timelines. But those red flags, Hall emphasizes, was soon buried under a tidal wave of unprecedented diplomatic pressure and media redirection. High-ranking British officials became involved. The narrative was quickly taken out of the hands of the local police and placed into the control of powerful actors who, for their own reasons, needed the abduction story to be the only story. The Tapas 7, in this view, were not just witnesses. They became assets, protected and shielded by institutional support. The most telling proof of this, protected, passive collusion, came in 2008. Portuguese authorities, in a final attempt to break the case and clarify the timeline, formally invited the Tapas 7 to return to Praia da Luz. They were asked to participate in a full on-site reenactment of the night of May 3rd, to walk through their stated timelines, to point out where they stood, and to answer questions on the ground. Not one of them returned. This mass refusal was a stunning, coordinated act of defiance. Hall interprets this not as the action of innocent, grieving friends eager to help, but as a deliberate and calculated evasion. It was an act likely supported and advised by the powerful institutional forces who now managed their story. They would not risk having their unified, rehearsed narrative challenged, dismantled, and exposed on Portuguese soil, where they were still, officially, persons of interest. This is the very definition of passive collusion, an unspoken agreement to not break the silence. Loyalty becomes the weapon, and the silence itself becomes the shield. In an investigation where a physical forensic trail seems to have been meticulously erased or methodically ignored, and where the witness testimony has solidified into an unbreakable, uniform script, investigators must turn to a different kind of evidence. They must look past what was done and listen, with exacting precision, to what was said. This is the realm of forensic statement analysis, a discipline that operates on a simple but profound thesis. The human brain seeks to tell the truth. Deception, especially about a traumatic, high-stakes event, creates an immense cognitive burden. A person must simultaneously juggle multiple layers of reality: what actually happened, what they claim happened, what they want to hide, and what they need others to believe. In that chaos, the truth finds a way to leak out. Independent analysts, such as Peter Hyatt, argue that these leaks are not direct admissions of guilt, they are embedded confessions. They appear in odd phrasing, in the specific choice of a verb, in the use of passive language, or in the very structure of a sentence. When a person constructs a lie, their language often betrays them. In his detailed analysis of the public statements, interviews, and press conferences given by Kate and Jerry McCann, Hyatt identifies multiple, recurring linguistic leaks. He argues that in these cracks of their carefully constructed narrative, the outlines of a different, unacknowledged story can be seen. The analysis begins with the very first words that formed the official narrative, the words reportedly shouted by Kate McCann as she ran back to the tapas restaurant. "They've taken her." On the surface, this is a cry of pure, unadulterated shock and terror. But to a statement analyst, this phrase is immediately and profoundly problematic. Why, they ask, did her mind immediately leap to that specific, complex conclusion? Why did she not first shout, "She's gone," or "Where is she?" or even, "Madeleine is missing"? These would be the natural, instinctive expressions of confusion, of discovery, of a parent confronted with an empty bed. Instead, her statement was one of absolute, immediate certainty. It contained two crucial components. First, the verb taken. This is not an observation of absence. It is a conclusion of action. It asserts, in that very first second, that a third party was involved. Second, the subject, they. This instantly creates a vague, faceless antagonist. It introduces an unknown, external force. To an analyst, this statement is not a natural cry for help. It is the announcement of a preloaded narrative. To assert abduction immediately, without any supporting evidence, no sign of a struggle, no broken window yet confirmed, no eyewitness, is to indicate prior knowledge, not discovery. It preempts all other theories and conveniently shifts the focus away from the speaker and the apartment and onto a hunt for a phantom they. This pattern of careful, distancing language, analysts argue, continues in the public statements made by Jerry McCann. One of his most repeated phrases, used for years, is, "There's no evidence Madeleine came to harm." At first glance, this sounds like a father clinging to optimism. But a linguistic deconstruction reveals something else. The statement is framed in the negative, no evidence, rather than the positive, such as, "We believe she is alive." It avoids the issue of what the speaker actually believes and instead introduces cold, legal language. It is the language of plausible deniability, not emotional conviction. Furthermore, the choice of words, came to harm, is a profoundly passive construction. It is not, no one hurt her. Instead, harm is presented as an abstract force that somehow arrived. This phrasing avoids attributing agency. It distances the speaker from the event. Hyatt remarks that this is not the language of hope. This is the language of legal shielding. It strategically prepares the audience for the possibility of harm while simultaneously denying any burden of proof. Perhaps the most revealing leak came when Jerry McCann was confronted in an interview about the most damning forensic evidence in the case, the startling, repeated alerts from the cadaver and blood detection dogs, Eddie and Keela, inside the apartment in the rental car. An innocent person, analysts argue, would be expected to confront this evidence directly. They might deny its validity, question the science, express outrage at the implication, or offer an alternative explanation. Jerry McCann did none of these. Instead, he reportedly replied with a short, sarcastic quip, "Ask the dogs." To an analyst like Hyatt, this flippant response is a classic example of linguistic deflection. It is a mechanism people use when faced with an uncomfortable, irrefutable truth. He did not deny the dogs' accuracy. He did not challenge their findings. He delegated the question, with sarcasm, to the animals themselves. Richard D. Hall calls this moment a reflexive leakage, a verbal release of profound internal tension. It was a moment, he argues, where the mask of composure slipped. Across hundreds of interviews, there is one final, deafening silence. It is the absence of a single, clear, declarative sentence. According to Hyatt, in all their public statements, one phrase is conspicuously missing from the McCann's lips. "We did not kill Madeleine." Innocent people, he argues, instinctively and repeatedly deny specific allegations with clarity and force. They say, "I didn't do it. That is not true. I would never." Instead, the McCanns speak in abstractions and persuasive statements. They say, "We love her. We would never harm her. She means everything to us." These statements, Hyatt bluntly concludes, are not denials. They are persuasion. And persuasion, he insists, is utterly unnecessary if one is telling the truth. From the very first hours of the investigation, a powerful and persistent narrative was established, largely by the British media. This narrative created a clear, simple dynamic. The grieving, sophisticated parents and their professional friends, versus the supposed incompetence of the local, provincial Portuguese police. The Polícia Judiciária, or PJ, were almost immediately characterized as bumbling, slow, disorganized, and ill-equipped to handle a major international case. They were accused of failing to secure the scene, of contaminating evidence, and of chasing flawed leads. This portrayal was not just incidental, it was strategically crucial. If the Portuguese police were deemed inept, then any of their findings, any of their conclusions, could be safely dismissed and ignored. But this caricature, analysts like Richard D. Hall argue, was a profound and deliberate distortion. The lead investigator for the Polícia Judiciária was Gonçalo Amaral. He was not a sleepy village constable. He was one of Portugal's most senior detectives, a man with extensive experience in complex, high-stakes criminal investigations. He and his team did precisely what competent investigators are trained to do. They followed the physical evidence, not the rapidly escalating media hysteria. While the world's press was being fed the story of the Tanner Man and the open window, Amaral's team was on the ground, looking at the facts. They saw a window that bore zero signs of forced entry. They saw the profound absence of any intruder, forensics, no foreign DNA, no strange fingerprints, no fibers, no trail. They methodically logged the bizarre and physically impossible contradictions in the timelines provided by the Tapas 7. Most importantly, they took the findings of the British specialist dogs, Eddie and Keela, with the utmost seriousness. While others would later dismiss the alerts, the PJ understood their chilling implication. The dogs had pointed to the scent of death and human blood inside the apartment, behind the sofa, and, most damningly, in the boot of a car rented 3.5 weeks later. Amiral's team synthesized these objective, scientific findings. They combined the lack of an intruder with the overwhelming forensic evidence of death. In his official internal report, finalized in 2007, Gonzalo Amiral and his team documented their stark conclusion. This document, rarely, if ever, mentioned in British media coverage, offers a candid summary of what the physical evidence actually showed. The report was devastatingly clear. It concluded that the evidence strongly suggested Madeleine had died inside apartment 5A. It concluded that there had been no break-in and no abduction. It concluded that the scene had been deliberately manipulated to simulate an abduction. It even noted that the media campaign, which was running parallel to their investigation, served more to distract and obstruct than to discover the truth. This was not a wild theory. This was the formal, evidence-based conclusion of the primary investigating police force. In a normal investigation, this report would have become the central, guiding hypothesis. But this was not a normal investigation. This conclusion, the Portuguese conclusion, was not just inconvenient, it was intolerable to the official narrative being built and fortified in the United Kingdom. The response was not a forensic debate or a request for clarification. It was, analysts argue, a swift and brutal campaign to neutralize the messenger. Gonzalo Amiral was subjected to immense and unusual political and diplomatic pressure. He was systematically vilified in the press, painted as an obsessive, xenophobic, and incompetent figure who was harassing a grieving family. He was, ultimately, removed from the case he was leading. But Amiral did not remain silent. He retired and wrote a book, A Verdade da Mentira, The Truth of the Lie. In it, he laid out his entire investigation, step by step, detailing the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the powerful conclusion that had led his team to believe the abduction was a fiction. The reaction to the book was unprecedented. An immediate, multi-year legal war was launched to silence him. The book was banned. Its distribution was halted for years. Amiral was entangled in lawsuits that threatened to ruin him financially, a legal battle that dragged on for the better part of a decade. The message, Hall insists, was unmistakable. This was not about finding the truth. This was about controlling the truth. The only official investigation that had dared to follow the physical evidence to its logical, terrifying conclusion was not just sidelined. It was, for all intents and purposes, systematically and publicly dismantled. When a 3-year-old girl vanishes from a seaside resort in Portugal, it should be a case for the police, for forensic scientists, and eventually for the truth. But in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, something else happened. The search for a child became secondary to the management of a story. The forensic findings were buried. Independent investigators were sidelined, and in their place, a single, dominant narrative was manufactured, marketed, and aggressively protected by some of the most powerful institutions in the United Kingdom. This, investigators like Richard D. Hall argue, was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate, high-level narrative machine. At the very center of this machinery was a man named Clarence Mitchell. Clarence Mitchell was not just any public relations spokesperson hired by a desperate family. He was a former director of the United Kingdom government's Central Office of Information, the government's own marketing and communications arm. He was a senior media handler who had once worked directly for the Prime Minister. In an unprecedented move, he was reassigned from his government post to become the full-time, dedicated media handler for the McCann family. In British history, few, if any, private citizens involved in a foreign criminal investigation have ever received such a high-level and dedicated government communications resource. Mitchell's role, Hall insists, was not limited to fielding questions from the press. He became the chief architect of the global message. And that message was clear, simple, and relentless. The McCanns were innocent, grieving victims. Madeleine had been abducted by a stranger. All efforts, all focus, and all funding should be directed only at the abduction theory. Any forensic inconsistencies, any conflicting witness testimonies, any of the profound contradictions in the timeline were either dismissed, suppressed, or simply overshadowed by a polished, multi-million-pound media campaign. The goal, Hall argues, was to keep the abduction narrative dominant, regardless of the evidence. And the evidence that needed to be buried was overwhelming. The most troubling elements were the forensic indicators that something had gone terribly wrong inside apartment 5A. There were the two specially trained British dogs, Eddie and Kella, who reacted strongly to the scent of human decomposition and blood, not at the window, but behind the sofa, in the bedroom, and most critically, in the boot of the car rented 24 days later. There was the complex DNA profile from that same car boot, matching 15 of 19 of Maleine's markers. In most homicide or missing person cases, this collection of forensic data would have triggered an immediate, intense, and focused inquiry on the occupants of the apartment. But not here. The British authorities and media, Hall points out, dismissed these findings as inconclusive or unreliable. The Foreign Office reportedly applied immense pressure on the Portuguese investigators, Gonçalo Amaral's team, to scale down their suspicion of the parents. The detailed forensic reports from the dog handler, Martin Ney, were never allowed to be fully tested in an open court of law. This, Hall insists, was not a failure of science. It was a strategic burial of inconvenient science. The problem wasn't the lack of evidence. The problem was that the evidence didn't fit the script. The presence of high-level government actors in what should have been a private criminal investigation remains, for many, the most baffling part of the case. The British ambassador arrived in Praia da Luz within days. Internal reports were allegedly compiled by MI5, the United Kingdom's domestic intelligence service, reports that remain classified to this day. And when Scotland Yard finally opened Operation Grange, their own multi-million-pound reinvestigation, its mandate was shocking. It was not, as Hall points out, to explore all theories and find the truth. Its mandate was publicly stated, to examine the case only from the abduction angle. This was not an investigation, it was a controlled narrative reinforcement. As Hall notes, this wasn't support, it was control. The official story was being narrowed and fortified, making it virtually impossible for alternative theories, no matter how evidence-based, to gain any ground. From 2007 to the present, the British media outlets followed suit. They almost exclusively echoed the official abduction story. No credible investigative outlets in the mainstream seriously pursued the forensic anomalies. Instead, those who questioned the official narrative, most notably the lead Portuguese investigator, Gonçalo Amaral, were vilified in the press. His book, which dared to suggest Madeleine had died in the apartment, was banned for years, tying him up in a financially ruinous legal battle. The Find Madeleine campaign, Hall concludes, became a professionally orchestrated public relations shield. The narrative was protected, the family became untouchable, and the truth, whatever it may be, was sacrificed for institutional stability. Richard D. Hall, and others who have challenged the official line, believe the system chose self-preservation over truth. Acknowledging the forensic evidence, they argue, would have shattered the constructed story. It would have implicated not just a family, but exposed a deeply uncomfortable level of institutional complicity, a machinery of government, media, and intelligence services capable of crafting and protecting a single reality. When a society prioritizes a comfortable narrative over a difficult truth, justice, Hall warns, becomes collateral damage.